Hi, my name is Jeff Sivens. I'm senior counsel at Haynes and Boone, and for the past 45 years have been an environmental lawyer, and for the past 30 years have been an adjunct professor at the University of Texas School of Law. For the past 4 years, I've been privileged to work with EarthX and Trammell Escrow and his colleague Bruce Fogarty in putting on an EarthX Law and Policy Symposium, bringing together thought leaders in the environmental community representing diverse perspectives to discuss issues critical to environmental protection. To help us develop these programs, we've assembled a distinguished advisory council of highly regarded environmental law practitioners from coast to coast. Because of the pandemic, our last symposium was virtual. In planning the next, we realized there was another opportunity available to us, EarthX TV, which would allow us to do individual programs on a range of important topics, and which would also allow us to have a continuing discussion on EarthX's website at EarthX League. Today is the first in a series of EarthX Law and Policy TV shows, and we're starting off with an exceptional one. We're excited to present to you today's topic, a pre-election dive into what the election portends for the future of environmental law. We have three leading environmental protection practitioners on our panel. We are fortunate to have as our panel moderator, John Cruden, a partner at the law firm of Beveridge and Diamond. John's accomplishments are truly remarkable and too numerous to mention all. After graduating from the United States Military Academy at West Point, John served in airborne, Ranger, and Special Forces units in Germany and Vietnam. He then went on to a distinguished law career. Pertinent to today's discussion, John is the former Senate-confirmed Assistant Attorney General of the Department of Justice responsible for environmental matters. While at the Department of Justice, John supervised some of the department's most significant litigation, including the Exxon Valdez oil spill, Love Canal, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and Volkswagen emissions scandal. Held in the highest regard by his peers, John is the former chair of the American Bar Association's section of Energy, Environment, and Resources, head of the Environmental Law Institute, and president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and one of the giants in our field, John Cruden, who will in turn introduce our other distinguished panelists. Here's John.
Jeff, thank you so much for your kind introduction. It's a real honor for all of us to be giving the inaugural webinar for EarthX. And Jeff, I want to thank you for your leadership. You've been leading not only Texas environmental law for a long time, but you've been the spearheading EarthX educational opportunities, which I think are extraordinary. For you in the audience, we want this to be a fun event, a relaxed event. I want you to think about, we're not virtual for a minute, we're sitting around a couch together and we're having a conversation about what happens after the election, which occurs just a week from now, and what is that going to mean for environmental law. And we're going to explore that together in a very conversational way. So we have the advantage of two of the finest and brightest environmental law experts in the United States. Seth Jaffe is a partner in Boston, and Foley Hoag, one of the great thinkers of environmental law. His blog on environmental law is one of the most read in the United States. And he's also the past president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers. Scott Fulton is the current president of the Environmental Law Institute, but he has a long history of environmental law at the Environmental Protection Agency, where he was a deputy general counsel, he was a general counsel and the acting deputy at the beginning of the Obama administration. He's also had an extensive career in environmental enforcement at the Department of Justice. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask each of them to give a very short, opening as to what they think are some of the most important issues that will be facing a new administration. Now, remember, this is not about the campaign right now. This is about either President Trump having a second term or Vice President Biden winning. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at the future, which would largely occur in January of next year. So they're both going to open with which they think are some of the most important issues. And we're going to start with Scott Fulton. And then we have a series of questions that have been gathered by a number of people that we're going to ask the panelists, and I'm going to participate. And we hope in that process, we're going to raise all of the issues that you should be interested in when you're looking at the consequences of this clearly important election on environmental law. So Scott, let's start with you. What do you think is the most important things that we should be thinking about?
Well, good greetings, everyone. And thank you, John and Jeff. Great to be part of this exploration at this very important moment in time. You know, rarely does an election present a starker choice and basic orientation and philosophy than this one does. There is a foundational divide in how we think about the role of government in solving society's problems, and especially the federal government. There are, of course, fundamental differences of view about the nature and seriousness of the problems themselves, which makes the outcome of this election especially impactful. What that outcome will be, of course, remains to be seen. We need to take care not to prejudge it. But since the changes would likely be most dramatic if Vice President Biden were to win, it's natural in this kind of brief conversation to focus a fair amount of the commentary on that possible outcome. I might refer viewers to ELI's recent report, Environment 2021, What Comes Next, which discusses in greater detail much of what we'll be talking about here, and also looks in a more complete way at the implications of either electoral outcome in terms of the important environmental questions of the day. Every new administration comes in with a list of things they want to change straight away. That's always part of the formula. The Trump administration, of course, came in with a deregulatory thrust following what it saw as a period of regulatory overreach. If Vice President Biden wins, we'll have an administration that sees its predecessors having presided over a period of deregulatory overreach. And they may also have some legacy interests in some of what the Trump administration has dismantled. The net of it is this: if Vice President Biden prevails, we'll likely see a new administration working through the pages of the same playbook used by the Trump administration. A key variable on which plays are usable will be what the election produces in terms of leadership changes in the Congress. If, along with a Biden win, the Democrats also get a majority in the Senate and preserve their control of the House, then other options come into play. There will be some areas of important substantive focus that will influence a new administration's approach. For example, climate change will be a major point of focus and is indeed really the key pivot point when it comes to environment, as the parties really could not be more diametrically opposed. Racial justice will likely be another point of focus in view of the recent crisis and the administration's positioning relative to it. For our purposes, what this means is likely revitalized focus on environmental justice. We could also see a reset on federal enforcement in view of the apparent accelerating downward trend in that area. There are some other major substantive areas that I'm sure my colleagues will be flagging. In terms of the tools that would likely be deployed by a Biden administration, we would expect they would include the following. First, suspension and reversal of key executive orders and policies and issuance of new ones. As these instruments do not themselves have the force of law and therefore generally do not require legal process to be changed, they are easily taken down or superseded. Second, on day one of a Biden administration, you would expect to see a freeze or a pullback of all rules pending in the Federal Register that are not yet final. This has happened in each of the last 3 party transitions. It would happen again. Third, if after the election the Democrats were to control both chambers of Congress, along with the presidency, then the Congressional Review Act comes into play. This 1996 law, which permits Congress to undo new federal rules by simple resolution, found its first really impactful use during the early days of the Trump administration, when it was used 14 times to undo Obama rules. Its utility to a Biden administration would, again, depend on a willing partner in Congress. And there are some questions here about the reach back day for the CRA, but it's likely that it would reach back to rules completed in the early summer of this year and thereafter. Fourth, a reset on international arrangements. Just as President Trump promised to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, candidate Biden has pledged to rejoin. And being part of the Paris Agreement again would likely influence a Biden regulatory agenda in various ways. It also bears mention that the resetting of the relationship with China would probably also have some interesting downstream implications on a range of environmental issues, including ambition on the level of climate change protection. Fifth, John will have more to say about this one, I'm sure, but there would be undoubtedly an examination of cases pending in court involving challenges to Trump-era rules, and the filing of motions to stay to allow a new administration to evaluate the government's position in court, or initiate superseding rulemaking, or choose not to defend the challenged rule. So these are just a few elements of what to expect and a few points of focus if we were to see a change in administration. So enough from me for starters, and let me get it back to John.
Scott, thank you. That's a lot. That's a lot of challenging issues for us to think about. But Seth, what do you think? What's going to happen?
Thank you, John. It is an honor to be here on EarthX and to be on a panel with both of you. There's a lot to talk about, and I'll try to be concise in my usual pithy self. I want to frame the issues I'm going to talk about in 2 ways. One is important substantive issues that are going to be teed up, whether continuing the path of the Trump administration or reversal by a Biden administration. I'll talk about a couple of those. One is WOTUS, the Waters of the United States rule. The other is air standards under the Clean Air Act, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. And both of those are important because they reflect an important divide at a higher level, kind of procedural level, how EPA does its business. Because they both implicate issues about how EPA uses science and the deference that EPA is going to be given. But first, I'll try to start on a more positive note, an important set of issues for either administration where there might be room for agreement and either might pursue. And that's two related things. One is infrastructure planning, and the other is renewable energy development, particularly wind, particularly offshore wind, but onshore wind as well, and solar. Both of those are issues that both parties often claim they're in favor of. And we've particularly noticed with the Biden administration, its plan, it's basically, and there's a reason why they say Green New Deal, and the green part may not get good press, but the New Deal part may have some legs. In other words, Biden's pitching this as a jobs program, and both parties like jobs programs. The Republicans may not want to do things where there's more money spent, but these are areas where there may well be, almost regardless of who wins the Senate, at least some potential for agreement between the parties to get some work done. And it is clear that if there is going to be, for example, significant renewable energy development, there's going to have to be significant infrastructure behind that with transmission lines and the like. And there's going to have to be cooperation between the parties. So that's that real quick. The other issues that are more about how EPA operates, but are illustrated by the substantive issues, are first, the Waters of the United States rule, and second, the criteria, pollutant standards under the Clean Air Act. WOTUS is a little bit different because the Trump administration has said very clearly, essentially, they don't care about the science. Their position is that the Clean Water Act does not authorize the extensive definition that Obama had done and that presumably Biden would return to. I think there's actually something to be said for that. On the legal merits, it's certainly an open question. And we'll have to see. If Trump wins, clearly they're going to be implementing this rule and defending it in court. And if Biden wins, they're going to be going back to the Obama rule or something like it. The ambient air quality standards begins really to tee up this issue about science. And I've speculated that this could be an issue that does what Republicans have long said. They want to end agency deference. The way it would happen, though, is a little bit different. It's not that Chevron would be overruled. It's just that a court would say, EPA, what are you doing? We're not giving you deference for your scientific conclusions when mainstream science says something different. And it will be really interesting in the courts to see what happens with challenges to Trump administration decisions regarding the NOx and particulate matter ambient air quality standards. There's an irony here, which I'll get to in a second, but it's, whether an administration likes deference depends upon whose decision is being challenged. It really is an important issue because for years, the ambient air quality standards basically stood or fell on one thing. And this is a little bit inside baseball, as both of you know, did the Clean Air Act Science Advisory Committee support the decision? And if they did, EPA wins. And if they didn't, EPA loses. But now we have a case act, as it's called, that is not in line with mainline science. So what gets followed? What gets deference? The broad range of science on these issues or the case act position, which has traditionally gotten deference? It's going to be very interesting. And finally, I'll raise one more issue that really ties all these together, which is NEPA reform, the Environmental Policy Act. Because as you both know, I've spent 33 years in private practice. I've never been in government. I've never been in an NGO. I've always been railing against the unreasonable bureaucrats. And I've always thought that NEPA needed reform. I didn't think it needed the kind of reform that it just got. And here's where this irony is really as evident as it could be, because the administration's defense of its changes to the NEPA regulations relies heavily on Chevron. Well, it's the conservatives who've been attacking Chevron. And here, the flip side is also true. We're going to have all the Greens and the Green states and the NGOs saying, this is inconsistent with the NEPA statute and you can't do this and you can't give deference to EPA's position. Well, it's going to be interesting what a court does with that. Are they going to use that sort of litigation as something to deal with Chevron overall, or are they going to duck the big picture Chevron questions and just deal with NEPA? I have said very clearly, I think that where you stand on the NEPA reforms depends upon where you sit. I think these regulations on their own merits are defensible, and they don't mean the end of serious environmental review. But under a Trump administration too, they absolutely could be used to shorten, to circumscribe, whatever verb or adjective you want to use, the nature of environmental reviews of complicated projects. And I'll just mention one last thing, which is when you tie this back to something Greens really want, which is renewable energy development, and you say, we're going to need a lot of infrastructure and it's going to have to get through NEPA quickly because we need these projects quickly. And then you think about people opposed to renewable energy development and can they use NEPA in a kind of NIMBY way to stop projects? That's where the rubber's going to hit the road on all these issues. And I'll stop there.
I think, Seth, what I like is you're presenting big macro issues like infrastructure reform, and then the more micro issues like WOTUS and what happened there, both of which are in play. There's other issues like that that clearly depend on who's in power. For instance, the whole issue of California cars. In the past administration, California had been given the authority to have their own cars. That changed during the Obama administration when we had dual standards with NHTSA. And now during this administration, that has been challenged. And I expect if President Trump stays in power for a second term, that'll continue. That litigation would continue. I would equally expect during a Biden administration that litigation would happen exactly the way that Scott projected, and that is the Biden administration would ask to stay that litigation, come up with different standards or new standards, and then project their own policy at that stage. So that's one thing that I think would be a difference. Interestingly, what I don't think there's a difference, and that is in support of nuclear power. Nuclear power, of course, is liked by many because it's carbon free. On the other hand, we all remember all the issues associated with nuclear waste and 3 Mile Island and those sorts of issues that have made it unpopular in some groups. But interestingly, both the Biden administration supports nuclear power, as does clearly the Trump administration. So there's an area where I don't think there'd be much of a change at all. One thing I think we should be looking at, and that is what's going to happen in the current stimulus plan debate. You raised infrastructure as an issue, which, by the way, the Trump administration has supported too, but never did. Biden administration makes that an extremely important issue, and it's an issue for jobs, it's an issue for green power and so forth. But the stimulus plan is also on the table right now. We don't know whether or not this will occur before the election or not. We're in the trillions of dollars. We're not in billions, we're in trillions of dollars right now. But how that money was used and how that came out would obviously have an effect on the economy, administration, jobs, and everything. If it does not occur during the Trump administration, I would expect that to be like the opening issues of a Biden administration, as it was for the Obama administration. Remember, that's what they did, big stimulus plan. I would expect that. There's one other area that I think gets overlooked a lot, and that is public lands. 28% of the United States, which includes most of Alaska, is a public land. Public land has any number of legal issues associated with it: mineral development, grazing, oil and gas development. Clearly, during this administration, the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture, who manage the public lands, have been aggressive in favor of mineral development, oil and gas development. My expectation is the Biden administration would not be. That they would withdraw some of those issues. And so I would see a big swing there as well. But with those sort of issues now that everybody's got to talk about, I want to go through, and we're going to try to get as many of these questions out because we have a number of them. Seth teed up very well the impact that courts will have in the future. And that is a linchpin of environmental law in general. There's so much of environmental law that has come to us through the court process. That means that every single federal judge makes a difference. What we're not going to cover today is the nomination of Justice Barrett, because we have a whole separate panel on the Supreme Court. But I do want to talk, and Scott, I'm going to ask you about just federal judges in general. President Trump has been able to get 194 federal judges confirmed, which is about 20% of the total. And that's a lot. How do you see that happening in the future? What happens if it's a second term of President Biden comes in? How those nominations occur? Does it matter then about who controls Congress?
Oh yeah, it matters greatly. All federal judges have to go through the process of Senate confirmation, and that's where it matters in terms of political control of the Senate. And part of the reason for President Trump's success in getting judges confirmed was Republican control of the Senate. Another reason was some sort of chiseling away of the opposition levers and mechanisms that were available. It really set up back before the Trump administration, but this administration has made very good use of, including the loss of the filibuster option and that sort of thing, which was frequently deployed in these appointment kinds of scenarios. So it's an extraordinary accomplishment for those inclined to see the positive side of the equation, to have moved this many judicial nominees through the system. It's amazing, actually. For those who are fearful about what those appointees will bring to the process of adjudication, I'm sure it's a worrisome phenomenon. I would guess I haven't seen a generational analysis of where the court system stands now, but I would just imagine, just by dint of the fact that a lot of the Trump appointees are on the younger side, that the opportunity space for the Trump administration will not be as grand or significant. I mean, for a Biden administration, would not be as grand or significant as that realized by the Trump administration. But that said, this clearly, given the success realized by the Trump administration in moving judicial appointees through, if the Senate turns and becomes a Democratic controlled body, I think we would see a much greater focus by this particular Democratic administration than may have been the case in the past, and in getting its own judicial placements made and secured.
Thank you. Seth, this is for you. Scott teed up one of the major changes that would come with a Biden administration would be focus on climate change. I was in the Obama administration. I was defending the president's Clean Power Plan, but in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, it did control the House and Senate and could not get through a climate bill. What do you see happening in another Congress with climate legislation? Do you see any legs for that or not?
You know, I wish I had the ability to predict things like that. I'd be off at the local casino. And it's interesting because Scott raised the issue about Democrats making judicial nominations, more of a priority. Well, that's going to be the issue. Okay, judicial nominations are a priority. Immigration is a priority. Obviously, first of anything, COVID is a priority. Climate is a priority. Any administration is going to have to deal with those issues. I still remember, well, I almost just got myself in trouble from a partisan viewpoint, but there was a moment early in the Obama administration when Senator Graham was working with Democrats on a variety of issues, including both immigration and climate, and he was really annoyed that the administration couldn't figure out what it wanted to focus on. I don't know what the administration is going to want to focus on. There's going to be a lot of pressure to focus on climate, and I think that's sort of why Biden has made at some level the climate plan a jobs plan, because if it's a jobs plan, it's a response to COVID, and then it's easier to prioritize than if it's just climate where he's not sure still people get a buy-in. I don't know the outcome. I think they're going to make a big push, and that's really about, I think, as much as anybody can say at this point.
Scott, you talked about legacy issues that, a new Biden administration might want to pick up. So we've talked about Waters United States, a Clean Power Plan, but there's another one, and it's the one that you know well. What about the whole problems with the city of Flint? During the Obama administration, that was a big deal. And everybody, this administration and certainly the Biden administration, has pretty much said, we don't want any more Flints. But how do you see that playing out?
A lot will depend on when and where the next problem emerges. Those of us who work in these issues know that what happened at Flint is not particularly unique to those circumstances. There were some reasons that the lead pipes found their way more readily into the taps that people were using and that sort of thing. But the basic reality is that from an infrastructure standpoint, we have lead pipes providing water delivery services all over this country. And the older the city, the older the development, the more guaranteed that is. It would be good if the focus and concern about Flint and the Flints of tomorrow would move the conversation towards how we work this idea more fully into the infrastructure objectives. So in addition to talking about transmission lines and transportation systems and that sort of thing, or even publicly owned treatment works and how we protect that infrastructure, we're also doing something about these lead service feeds for water consumers all over the country. There's a need to replace these old pipes, and there really isn't a systematic or comprehensive effort underway to make that happen. And until we move in that direction, we stand continually at risk of another Flint, Michigan.
John, can I jump in here and
Yes,
add
sir.
something? So I think Scott's hit it on the nose. I would just kind of give a little inflection to it. Clearly, we're more likely to get something done about it if it can get moved into the infrastructure debate. Second, everybody's going to be trying to move everything into the infrastructure debate. And then the cost of a stimulus package involving infrastructure is just going to go up. And then Republicans are going to discover that they actually care about budget deficits. And so that's really the problem, is how much stuff can you load on there? But that's clearly the right answer, is it's another infrastructure problem. And that's not just verbiage, it really is a major infrastructure problem.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Although that does give an opportunity too for back to either administration. Either administration can have there. I have been given two questions, which I will take myself. The first question is all about hydraulic fracturing. That the vice president debate there, there was a whole question, went back and forth. What was the respective positions? Obviously, the Trump administration has promoted hydraulic fracturing, which gives us natural gas. Natural gas is only half the carbon issues associated with normal oil and gas production. And I think I can handle this one simply because clearly the Trump administration supports a Biden administration has said we will not ban hydraulic fracturing. However, it appears that they would not allow it on public land. So I already mentioned to you that public lands is a big issue. That might be one example of a difference between the two. The other question I have is, what about water quantity issues? I've often said when I'm on the East Coast lecturing, I'm talking about water quality. When I'm on the West Coast, I'm talking about water quantity. And by that, I mean, there's not enough. Some of our major rivers, Rio Grande, Colorado River, others are not supplying the water that they used to. This is a function of any number of factors, more needs, climate change, and whatever. The Supreme Court this term has two different arguments by states suing other states. New Mexico versus Texas, Florida versus Georgia, and that's all about dividing up water. My own view of that is either administration is going to have to deal with that. A Biden administration will have to deal with water quantity shortage. A Trump administration has to deal with that, and that's hard going. That's hard going when you're trying to allocate those issues. But I don't see a significant difference. I just think that's a challenge for any administration.
I mean, my response is, and it's a depressing one, but it is nonpartisan, is the way they deal with it is by punting. That's the way they always deal with it. The book Cadillac Desert was now almost 30 years ago. And it is obvious for those who paid attention, at least in the West, we actually settled the West in a time that was unusually wet, even aside from climate change. So now you have this double whammy. We're in a more normal, or we were in a more normal period for Southwestern rainfall, except now we're abnormal on the other side because climate change is drying out the Southwest, and there are no good answers. And I know what administrations do when there are no good answers. They avoid doing anything.
Yes, Seth, I think it was Mark Twain who made the quote that liquor is for drinking and water is for fighting. And we're fighting now. All right, Seth, I'm going to give you this. Let me show you. This is a memorandum from the Office of Management and Budget, dated August the 11th. It's called Implementation of Section 6 of the Executive Order 13924. But what it really is quite a long memo put out by OMB to all the agencies, which focuses on enforcement. So clearly, if there is another term, if there's a second term of the Trump administration, this document is going to have an impact on enforcement in the future. Can you just give a couple of examples, Seth, where this might have an effect, so that our
my favorite issue, and
this document has not received much attention.
No.
And I do think, since we're talking about second term as well, that it will. So can you do that?
Yeah. Thank you for that, because I love this issue. And thank you for publicizing my blog, because I blogged about the underlying executive order. And I said, this may be the single most important deregulatory action the Trump administration has taken. And it didn't get much press. And if he wins the second term, I think we're in agreement. We'll see. I may not be right with my hyperbole, but I may not be far off. So here's the fundamental issue, which is basically there are a bunch of important stuff. I don't think we can get into all the details of the order or the memorandum, but just one, and it kind of highlights it, and I do think it's the most important, is the executive order says all agencies, and then that's what the memo was about, is how the agencies implement this, shall look into not taking enforcement action against anybody who's made a good faith effort to comply. And, you know, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but all of us who are good lawyers at some point went to law school, and we learned about the development of strict liability. And then we learned about, you know, regulations about corporate strict liability. And we have all these laws on the books now that essentially provide for strict liability. And the Trump administration is saying, we're not having any of it. We are not going to enforce against people who try to comply. So here's, you know, the practice tip I gave all my clients is document everything you were doing, showing that you were trying to comply, and then keep a copy of this executive order in your back pocket at all times. If the Trump administration wins, and if they mean it, it's going to be really interesting. And it also goes back to some of our other discussion about the role of the courts and what do the courts do with an administration approach to enforcement that says we're not enforcing against people who try to comply when the statutes provide for strict liability. Tradition, and the one reason I think this is so important, and then I'll stop, give you a chance to comment, and maybe Scott, is normally you think of that as enforcement discretion, and the courts are never going to get into that. So it's a way that the Trump administration really can narrow enforcement, because it's hard for a court to say, administration, you wrongly exercised your enforcement discretion by refusing to prosecute. Now, if they, in response to the memorandum from OMB, come out with a policy that says we will not enforce against people who are making good faith efforts to comply when the statute says otherwise, that's going to be an interesting issue for judicial review.
Scott, anything?
Yeah, I guess on the non-reviewability of enforcement discretion or prosecutorial discretion, there is this thread in the case law that suggests that if you are abandoning a statutory responsibility, which might include the effectuation of a statutory cause of action, so outright abandonment, that can give rise to judicial review, even though generally exercises of prosecutorial discretion are not subject to review in court. But, you know, I think that there's another piece to this that probably bears discussing, which is just the relationship between the executive order, the guidance from OMB, and what ultimately EPA does in response to that. The executive order itself, of course, is without legal effect. It's a direction to the branches of the executive branch to move forward in this fashion. But the executive order itself, and I think this OMB guidance also allows a little bit of space for agencies and departments to make a demonstration that their existing body of guidances and policies are roughly in alignment with what the administration is trying to accomplish, such that dramatic change might not be necessary. And it's worth remembering that EPA in particular is the most scrutinized of all federal agencies in terms of how it uses its various authorities, including administrative enforcement, how it conducts inspections and that sort of thing. So EPA has a lot of existing guidance and direction that are intended to make sure that it doesn't abuse its authority, that people are treated fairly, that guidance isn't misused in an enforcement context, and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if the agency tries to make the case that it's largely in compliance. And on this issue of leniency and reserving enforcement for willful violations, there may be an argument that because the civil penalty policy allows you to take these things into account, your basic construct in terms of guiding decisions on what to refer to the Department of Justice allows you to take good faith into account. You know, maybe there's a case that can be made that in the sum of all that is kind of directionally consistent. But the bottom line is that the agency has not yet taken policy action in response to the May executive order and is trying to figure out what to do in response to the OMB guidance. So this ends up being, I think, very election sensitive, what happens with this particular executive order and the agency follow through. If the Trump administration carries forward, we'll see. And it may be that this constriction that a lot of people see in the enforcement program through these executive orders will be realized. In fact, at the end of the day, if Biden administration comes in, these things aren't likely to go anywhere or mean that much over the longer haul.
Yeah, I think that's a great closing. In just a second or so, I'm going to ask each of you to give about 30 seconds. But for the audience, I'm sitting here with another dozen questions that I could ask. I can ask about emerging chemicals. I can ask about who's going to be the next in the Biden administration, who would be the next EPA, who would be the next Attorney General. There's an enormous number of questions yet. And I want to whet your appetite because we're going to come back. We're going to come back after the election, and then we'll know. And then we can talk more specifically about things that will happen, because by then we'll know who the next president is. But now we don't. And now we're trying to tell you both what would happen on either side. So Seth, you first, and then Scott, 30 seconds, wrap it up for us.
I wish it were so easy. So I'll give one other example actually of an issue, because I think it speaks to where we may end up, and that's plastics. These were known forever chemicals, PFAS. And the reason I mention it is there's been a lot of congressional pressure for EPA to take action on these substances, including pressure from Republicans, because they have incidents in their districts where these things are a problem and their constituents really care. At some level, it shows the power of Superfund as opposed to air, where air may be what really matters, but it's not as localized, so it doesn't have the support that that Superfund has. I think we're going to have to see what happens with issues like that. I think we may well see, and this goes to, again, my bigger issue of like how much deference do agencies get and all that. We may see Congress on this issue saying, we're not giving you any deference. We're going to tell you what the blinking answer is, and you're going to go do it. And that's really what we're going to be wondering about for the next 4 years is what can Congress get done? How much do they specify versus leaving it to the agencies? And then how much clear direction do courts want to see from Congress before they're going to accept what the agency does to implement?
Good point. Scott, your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, maybe three quick thoughts. One is in the realm of what's possible. The second is sort of a wish. And the third is perhaps a pipe dream. In terms of what's possible, I want to go back to Seth's observation that in the no matter what happens category, something ought to be possible on the infrastructure point. And the parties should be able to work together on that. I'll just flag one other environmental item that I think is workable if attention could be brought to it, and that is RCRA amendment of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This is a law that's pretty seriously out of step with modern thinking on materials management that could be re-examined. We could create new pathways for recycled and renewable materials that don't currently exist because of the way RCRA operates. It'd be great to see some focus brought to that. I think it's possible to do something in a bipartisan way around that. On the wish list, I wish that it would be possible and if for a national energy policy to emerge, it would take climate change into account and allow us to see what our progression needs to look like to get from where we are now to where we want to end up, which is in a low carbon future. And these practical questions about how heavily we should rely on natural gas in the near term, whether fracking can be part of the natural gas contribution ultimately to reducing our carbon footprint in the near term, only makes sense when you examine them in the context of that kind of national energy policy, energy transmission lines, storage, all those questions. It would be great if we had that all bundled up so that we could make rational decisions instead of being sort of flip-flopping back and forth. Final thing, this is a pipe dream. I wish an administration would reach in the direction of truly durable change. Instead of just following the now kind of increasingly traditional pattern of snapback politics and snapback policies that provide a short-term dividend, a short-term yield, often a political yield, but don't offer the promise of longer-term predictability and stability. That's my pipe dream.
It's a good pipe dream.
I want to thank very much our panelists, and I have one more challenge for our audience. The three of us believe passionately about democracy in general. Some of you have already voted. Those of you who have not, in the next week, do so. That is how you exercise democracy. That's how you do it. I have a young grandson who just started college. He'll make his first vote. There's a lot of young people on this call. There's a lot of young people listening. Do it. Be excited about it. Learn these issues. We don't care how you vote, just vote. We believe in America. We believe we're in a wonderful country with a bright future, but it requires people like you to learn about environmental issues and other issues and exercise what is a privilege as well as a right to vote. But thank you to Jeff, thank you to EarthX, thank you to Trammell Crow and so many others. Bruce Fogarty has put this together. And we will look forward to coming back to you and talking to you again after the election. That's it. We're signing off.